It feeds off of your fear. There was a rich family of 4 visiting their vacation home in Phillipsburg, Montana. There was a man, his wife, and their 2 kids. Their house was located at the bottom of the mountain right next to the trailhead. When they arrived there, they were all very tired and just wanted to sleep after their 4-hour flight from San Antonio, Texas. It was the middle of September when they came up. They loved all the colors of fall. The father, Daniel, 38, forgot to start their boiler outside of the house, so it was extremely cold as they tried to sleep. None of them caught too much sleep that night, but they got up in the morning and got the boiler started and got warmed up. As they were drinking their morning coffee, getting warm, snowflakes started to float down from the sky. They had never seen very much snow before, given that they were from Texas. After only an hour, there was about 20 inches of snow and the kids were out playing in it. By noon there was 40 inches and they were starting to realize they might be stuck there for a while. The BMW car they drove there was completely buried by nightfall. There was 7 feet of snow by the time it quit snowing. That night Daniel didn't get any sleep. He kept thinking he heard knocking at the front door. Once he finally fell asleep, the knocking woke him again. He got up to investigate. He walked down the stairs and to the door, opened the door, and there was nothing there, just a disgusting amount of snow. After he went back to his bed, he fell asleep just fine, chalked it up to his paranoia. The next morning after their morning coffee, the kids Bethany, 12, and Austin, 10, wanted to go for a walk up the trail. They all got their snow gear on and started their trek up the mountain. After about 3 hours of walking, they found a small frozen lake encapsulated by trees. At the far end there was a quaint little cabin sitting atop a rock outcropping. They walked around the lake and to the cabin. It was abandoned, so they went in and took a break. Daniel and his wife, Misty, 37, took a nap and the kids just played on their phones and eventually fell asleep. They all snapped awake when a deafening scream was heard from the other side of the lake. They shared the same sleepy, confused glances with each other. After about 10 minutes of silence, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. It was about this time that they realized they didn't bring any food. Daniel got up and shut the door to block the wind. They were all hungry and very cold. Austin was begging Daniel to let him go out to try and get back home. Daniel wasn't going to let just one of them go. It was all or none. They agreed that they were going to snuggle on the floor and try to get some sleep. When they woke up in the morning, the weather had calmed down and it started to snow again. More notably, Austin was nowhere in sight, and there were no footprints coming or leaving their cabin. Then they started looking around in the woods. They all walked together, and after walking for a little bit they found little specks of blood in the snow. When they looked around, the blood didn't trail anywhere. When they looked up, a headless elk was flayed about the tops of 3 trees, pieces thrown all around. Upon seeing this, Bethany fainted and Misty started to cry. Daniel was just trying to figure out what could have done this. Just when Misty gathered herself and Bethany woke up, they started their walk back to their mansion on the lake, hoping they would find Austin on the way. As they walked, they approached a small hill, and when they crested the hill, there was a quaint little cabin sitting at the end of a small lake. They walked the same path 4 times and still ended up at the same spot every time they crested the small hill. They finally decided just to settle down and sleep in the cabin since night was beginning to fall. Right as night fell, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. Just as Daniel was about to fall asleep, he heard knocking on the door and Austin's voice yelling to let him in. Daniel jumped up and swung the door open, and there stood Austin, pale as a ghost and deep dark black eyes. Austin came in and snuggled up next to his mom and sister, but something just seemed off about Austin to Daniel. He didn't have the same gait and his mannerisms seemed off just enough to worry Daniel. He just chalked it up to Austin having a long day and dozed off to sleep. When Daniel awoke, Austin was sitting in the corner just staring at Daniel. Daniel asked him what he was doing and got no response from Austin, just sitting there with a senseless stare. After about 5 minutes, Misty and Bethany woke up and Austin started to act less weird. The next day was too windy to consider leaving, so they just stayed indoors and tried to conserve heat. But it had been 3 days since they had eaten last, and they were starting to get extremely hungry. When the sun was falling over the horizon, Austin jumped up and took off running over the now frozen lake. As he ran, his family was screaming for him to come back and that it was too cold. While he was running, he seemed to grow in height and his arms became freakishly long while hugger antlers proceeded to protrude from his head. His form was getting broken up by the snow being carried by the wind. Daniel decided he was going to chase after Austin and try to help him. The farther he got from the cabin, the colder he got, and he felt exponentially more hungry. Just about the time when he stopped to catch a breath, he heard an ungodly loud, guttural scream. The scream got louder and louder as thunderous footsteps were starting to come into earshot. Daniel lay down under the snow, trying his best to hide from whatever was after him. The scream stopped and all he could hear was footsteps and labored breathing. He popped his head above the snow, and what he saw was traumatizing. What stood 20 feet from him was a 12-foot-tall human figure with arms that dangled to the snow with huge claws on each finger. Atop his neck sat an elk skull, and there was a stringy substance hung off of it everywhere. He must have gawked for too long because he gained the creature's attention. The last thing Daniel saw was a huge mouth equipped with long fangs and bloody strings hanging from them. Misty sat in horror as they heard immensely loud shrieking followed by blood-curdling screams of her husband being eaten. As Misty and Bethany had begun to accept their fate, they found a lighter on the floor in the corner. With this new addition to their arsenal, they could finally help the blistering cold they were feeling. They started a small fire using floorboards in the fireplace. Just as they were warming up, they began to hear knocking on the door. Neither one of them had the courage to open the door and allow whatever was out there to end them. The knocking wouldn't stop. It went from the door to the windows and just everywhere. It seemed to encapsulate them. They could not sleep. The knocking would not stop. Then it stopped, suddenly, just as fast as it came, it left. Then the voices came, the voices of Austin and Daniel pleading to let them in. Misty and Bethany both knew that whatever was mimicking their ill-fated family wasn't something they wanted to let in. They roughed it through the night. Not one of them got a blink of sleep. With the morning came the sun, something they hadn't seen in days it seemed. The weather was considerably nicer than the day before, and they were making a plan to get out of there. They stepped onto the porch, and there was a beaten path through the 5 feet of snow all the way around their cabin. They ran, and didn't look back. Bethany was younger than her mother and had more stamina, therefore she was leading the way. They made it past the barrier hill, and Bethany stopped to look back, and her mom was gone, just no trace. So Bethany ran, and ran. As she ran, she felt an overwhelming feeling of grief about leaving her mom behind. As she came within sight of her dad's mansion, she turned around and ran back to find her mom. She got back to the hill and her mom was crawling over the top, so Bethany ran up to help her. Her mom's lower half had been ripped completely off, but her legs were so badly frostbitten it wasn't too big of a deal. Bethany went and held her mom in her last moments. As Misty died, she muttered some incoherent phrase, and Bethany suddenly felt at peace. She headed back to her dad's mansion and warmed up and got some food. She figured it would be a good idea to go shower. When she walked past the mirror, she saw something unexpected. A small set of antlers protruding from her hair.